With your host, Adrian Young.
We are in an age where science dictates reason. Nevertheless, we are also in an age where faith dictates choice. And you see, that's where we came from, a time when social stratification was based on choices of faith, amongst other variables other than race. And you must comprehend the notion that race is a concept that is relatively new. Race-based classification was forged by avaricious white men, not women, but white men that felt destined to conquer. Westerners that forced Christianity and Catholicism on indigenous people, killing them and enslaving them under the doctrine of faith. And when you study history, you begin to understand how malleable faith actually is, how it could be twisted and contorted in order to satisfy the wants of the same men that used race to subjugate the indigenous, that used race to transport the indigenous across the Atlantic as God presumably commanded, since manifest destiny is purportedly justified by faith. One faith-based British pastor, John Newton, traveled the Atlantic as the captain of a slave ship. The seafarer had a near-death experience and promised God that should he survive, he would convert to Christianity. He survived, and this cemented his faith. Nevertheless, his faith allowed him to rape, flog, and murder innocent African people while simultaneously holding sermons to bring fellow captors closer to God. He was especially brutal on women and children. He had a reputation as an unrelenting and malevolent slave trader. His health problems, and not faith, forced him to quit sailing in order to pursue priesthood, while still avidly supporting the transatlantic slave trade. Now, towards the end of his life, he blessed the world with one of the most boring hymns ever created, a hymn with a message for forgiveness and redemption, regardless of sins committed, as the soul can be delivered from despair through the mercy of God. A hymn that has received high praise and unequivocal acceptance by the Baptist and Methodist Church. A hymn created after he became an abolitionist towards the end of his years. An emblematic black spiritual that became canonized during the 60s by so many black icons singing the tune. The song is called Amazing Grace, and I can't stand it, especially because I know where it comes from, but to each his own. I bring this up because American and British history sanitizes the story of John Newton, the author of this heralded song. He is taught as being a sailor that had a near-death experience, thereafter gave his life to the Lord, and penned one of the illest hymns of all time. There is never any talk of his nefarious past. There is no nexus between his evil and his Christianity, just like the Southerners. You know why? Because he falls into a category that I define as the exceptional racist. If you are awarded this title, you are allowed a historical pass, just like Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, the father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims. You listeners, please look up that name, J. Marion Sims, that performed shocking experiments with no anesthesia on enslaved women for the express benefit of the white woman. His statue adorned New York Central Park for decades before being removed just a few years ago, but the removal did not come without a backlash because he was an exceptional racist with merit, kind of like George Washington. And again, just like faith, we are also in the age of science because we are civilized, right? Science brought us to eugenics, a study of the human species where by American and British scientists were paid by the government to prove the superiority of the white race, to prove why miscegenation or mixing should be illegal, to prove why my cranium size would not allow me to develop the neuron and nerve connections to suffer pain in the way the white race does, therefore justifying corporal punishment and the inferiority complex that continues to plague my people. Now, am I a mere rejection of Anglo conformity, or simply the product of exceptional faith and science-based leaders that never sanitized the ideology of the African diaspora, the development of a holy America? I brought an exceptional guest to help me discuss this issue. She's an activist, author, scholar, and a professor at Vanderbilt University, an avid supporter of the Black consciousness and identity, being named by the Southern Living publication as one of the 50 people changing the South. You could find her scholarly refuting trash or talking shit on MSNBC, as well as other outlets that need help in understanding racial bias and the Black idiom. Please welcome my venerable friend, Caroline Randall Williams. How are you?
I am wonderful, Adrian. Thank you so much for having me. As you were talking, I had to go. I just bought new notebooks. I just had to go pick up my notebook and my pen. As you were making your introduction, I've taken a page of notes already. So
wow,
I'm so excited to talk to you
dope.
about all of this.
The problem is that when I talk to you, I never want to stop because you're just so insightful, and I love your perspectives. They're always very novel and different and captivating. And I just want to get right in. You know, you wrote a powerful New York Times article, and you've spoken on this subject many times, providing, again, a very novel perspective. I'll start with the quote. I have rape-colored skin. My light brown blackness is a living testament to the rules, the practices, and the causes of the Old South. If there are those who want to remember the legacy of the Confederacy, if they want monuments, well, then my body is a monument. My skin is a monument. I ask you, do you celebrate your skin?
That's a hard question to ask in the sense that, well, the short answer is yes, I do. I will say it's hard because I'm so, the older you get and the more you wade into these conversations, I already am, I try to be conscious of my privilege as a Black person, and as a Black person, I know so much of my family's story. That's a privilege. Yeah. My education is a privilege. Being raised by a mother who could, with the resources that she had, that's a privilege. My light skin is also a privilege. And so to say like, well, I celebrate it, it's like, it's a privilege that I didn't earn, and it's made my life. And so I name that. But to me, when I say I celebrate it in the same way that I framed it in the article, that I think it's a really helpful tool for dismantling certain ideologies and certain kinds of unblinkered nostalgia. And I also think it's a testament to the women that I come from who endured things and transcended their trauma by creating, by making room in the world for me. So I think that it tells a story that's important in both directions. So I celebrate it for that, for sure.
That is beautiful. Because when we think of statues, right, made to commemorate people or events, and when you made this analogy of you essentially being a monument, it just made me think so deeply on what that really means. And it made me think about what skin color actually means, right? Because you talk about the privilege that you receive as a Black woman being of a lighter hue, but at the end of the day, you're still perceived as a Black woman, So it's a very interesting perspective to have. And it's something that I don't hear many people talking about,
I should say, at the end of the day, I'm still considered a Black woman. Thank God, right?
No, exactly.
That's my first thought when I hear that. I should also say, here's the nerd in me. the original, I think the root, I'm not a classicist, but I am an English major and I do love root words of words that we use in English. And what I will say is that as far as I understand, monument comes from a root that monere, I think. And I think that it also means to warn.
Mm.
And I think that that's a really important part of, when I said my body is a monument, I think it's also a warning against forgetting what the truth actually looks like. Because it's a monument to the Black people I come from, but it's also a warning about the white people I come from, my skin. And a monument is not just a memorial. Because, to me, like the gates of Auschwitz are a monument also, right? And they're a testament to the people who survived, the people who are lost, and also to what happened. They are a warning about what happens when we don't, when we don't shore up like the moral system of a culture.
It's interesting that you bring up the Germans, because the Germans have done something different when it comes to the concept of monuments versus what America has done. Can you talk about that?
I think one of the things that's complicated about how the Germans have gotten it right in ways that America really needs to learn from, and yes, that's a hard pill to swallow because the Holocaust is so indisputably heinous and so indisputably without precedent in many ways. But, and yet, and what's complicated is that I think that one of the reasons that Germany got it right is because they got caught and because there's a record. And what I mean by that is like, I think that we'd be having a different conversation if there had been newsreels in the Congo watching what King Leopold was doing. I think that we'd be having a different conversation about without precedent or not if there had been cameras in the bellies of the boats of the Middle Passage. So one, there's like these questions about economies of scale, about like the relative suffering, or if it's not relative, if it's proportionate, that are really complicated for me to answer or complicated for me to address because of how important it is to honor the stark, gruesome realities of what happened in Germany and Poland and in Western Europe in World War II that are particular and grievous, right? And then, but all of that to say that Germany got caught. And what they did do when they got caught was they said, we are going to rout out these people and we are going to put them on trial for the world to see. And we are going to, there's no way to pay for this human life, but we are going to, enact measures to like model our understanding that we have cost a very great deal. And that is going to take the form of like tangible compensation. And America's never done that. We've talked about reparations. I mean, the American Indians are owed reparations in terms of like, monetary and geographical resources. Black people are owed reparations. And I think the best that America's ever done is sort of say, we're awful sorry, let's forget that happened. And I think that that's where, as opposed to saying we did grievous harm and here's the tangible measures that we're taking to address it.
Well, yeah, in Germany, there was a denazification that was pretty real, like burning fascist periodicals and really the physical vestiges of that old regime. And conversely, what we have done here is instead of denounce that history, we decided to put these people that we're defining as Southern heroes on the names of schools and hospitals and museums. We chose to edify these degenerates. And I love the fact that you brought up the concept of reparations, because that is something. See, it's funny because when we use the word complicated, it's really not that complicated. They try to make it complicated. So that's why I guess we could use the word complicated, right? But as far as getting it right, you are absolutely correct regarding this notion of reparations. And what a lot of people don't actually really know about American reparations is that Black people got a little piece, like they got a little bit of unwanted land. When you go to the like the Geechee area, like those areas they got little pieces here and there, but they didn't get the type of reparations that white enslavers got in America, and the same thing in Britain. Also, the German government created Article 2, and it was a program that created, it was a program that happened after the reunification of the East and the West of Germany in the 90s. And it's a program that created like a monthly stipend to compensate the victims that suffered these unconscionable crimes. And to date, Germany has paid about $91.9 billion. This is a model America could use, but America is a bit too stingy. And just like you said, yes, the Native Americans have received a little bit reparations, like 1.6 billion or something for the seized land. But also in 88, the Japanese Americans got 1.6 billion for what they lost in internment camps, right? The point is, like, a lot of people talk about the fact that, well, slavery happened in 1865 so long ago. How can we connect all the way back, right? But what they fail to realize is the protracted government sponsorship of racism that has continued to unequivocally subjugate the Black socioeconomic position. And this is where it arguably gets complicated when it's really not complicated. Help people out because these other governments are doing it. And a lot of people are afraid of reparations because they view reparations as something that is punitive instead of restorative. So it don't make no damn sense. You know what I'm saying?
Well, so this is what is complicated though, is that when we say my fellow Americans, we don't all mean the same thing. And I think I mean everybody, but it's like, it's the paradox of tolerance, right? Because it is punitive if you don't believe that Black people should have extra stuff. If you don't actually believe in equity and equality, if you're actually a racist, then giving up some of your resources to support and restore the Black American condition, that's punitive because you don't see it as doing something for your fellow Americans to restore equity and freedom. And so it's complicated to figure out how to reconcile the fact that there are people who think that helping Black people out and actually not even restoring, we've never had an equitable condition.
That's kind of deep, right?
So it's not even restoration.
Yeah.
It's it's a restoration of an American ethic across the American votership.
Absolutely.
It used to be that like everyone who could vote in America thought America was like the land of their free, at least. Yeah. So because it was rich white men and America was the land where they didn't have to pay taxes. I mean, the Republican Party is King George, but we can get back to that later.
Yeah. Yes.
But like, I think the question of how do we all, like, now I can vote. I'm a woman and I'm a Black person in the South and I can vote. And I don't think America is the land of the free. So what we're restoring is this idea that America can be a land of the free to all of its enfranchised citizens. And people are afraid of that because it will be punitive for them because they don't see themselves as operating with the same type of citizenship as us. That's what's hard about it, is like reconciling these two fundamentally opposed positions within the American identity. And maybe it's, maybe when I say, I have a line in my poetry collection where I wrote, simple and easy ain't the same thing.
Yeah.
And maybe it's simple, but it's not easy because it's like so component. Okay. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm thinking. And also though, I should say, you talked about how we did get these little bits of land they didn't want, but then even that 98% of the land that was given to Black Americans as reparations has been subsequently stolen back.
Exactly.
Like read The Great Land Robbery,
exactly.
everyone. Like Van Newkirk, like read that.
Exactly.
Read that. Anyway.
Absolutely. I got a simple question for you. It may not be easy. Should the Confederate soldiers be deemed as American heroes?
That's an easy and a simple question. No. Absolutely not. Like under no circumstances.
Okay.
They weren't even Americans by virtue of them being Confederate soldiers, which was a treasonous state created in opposition to the United States of America. They're not American heroes. They were Confederates who might have seemed heroic to their compatriots who were not at the time of their fighting Americans. So yeah, no, they should not be considered heroes. I'm just gonna like aside here because you don't know that I'm working on this, but I think it's a fun thing to tell. We can revisit it.
Go for it.
I'm working on this poem, and in it, there's a line that is, what does it mean to be a twice stolen thing? Right? Because, stolen from Africa. And then, and again, this is just to underscore the point that the Confederate States were not American states. Because under the rules of war, you can confiscate the contraband of the enemy. And that is how the Union justified smuggling slaves out of slavery into some version of freedom, because the slaves were classified, or the enslaved African Americans were classified as property. And because under the Fugitive Slave Act, you had to transport a slave back.
Yes.
But you don't have to return contraband to an enemy of the United States. And so classifying, so it's this like, can I cuss on this? This messed up, this like the fucked upness of the fact that in order to get free, we had to be reclassified again as goods. But the South built us that they built that system they built a system where human beings could be considered goods that then could be confiscated by their enemies. All of that to say, that's not the United States. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, when and I talk about this a lot on this podcast. I mean, when you think about Abraham Lincoln, he's Honest Abe, and he supposedly freed the enslaved, but the Emancipation Proclamation was merely a military move to destabilize the South. And the border states, Emancipation Proclamation didn't even apply to. So the border states that weren't necessarily part of the South, weren't necessarily part of the Union, were allowed to continue to practice slavery. So it's all a hypocrisy, but there's this romanticism. And in 1894, one of our actual heroes, Frederick Douglass, said, "I shall never forget the difference between those who fought for liberty and those who fought for slavery." Okay? So in the retelling of the Civil War, what I like to call revisionist history 101, the Union and or the Confederacy was not really wrong. They were merely fighting for Federalist disagreements. This is the revisionist history, and my undergrad is political science. This is the kind of stuff that we were, talking about when I was in college. So the reason why his quote is so important is because it exemplifies his post-antebellum war on perspectives, a war on perspectives that changed the way America saw American history. Because between 1890 and around 1920, this war was a war against memory. To claim that the Southerners lost the war, but fought with sensationalized virtue and valor. And then this was further exemplified by history books, college curriculums, hundreds of statues in courthouses and city parks that, like I said, romanticize the South, and this romanticism became ubiquitous. So I ask you this: does the reinforcement of skewed history excuse Southerners for edifying their history and basically commemorating their own glory? Does it excuse them? And this kind of goes back to my opening with, like, should they have this pass for being, quote, exceptional racists with merit?
Well, no. No, again, is the short answer.
Yeah.
The question of Abraham Lincoln is a really complicated one. And, he's quoted as having said something like, if I could have won the war by freeing no slaves, I would have done that.
Yes.
If I could have won the war by freeing all of them, I'd do that. Right? Like, he's like, whatever will win the war.
Absolutely. Calling them poor creatures. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And restore democracy. And restore democracy's dream. I still think that intention and outcome have important roles to play alongside one another. And the outcome of his presidency and his was ultimately the end of slavery.
Hmm.
And he made choices that did that. And that to me, by accident or on purpose, is still, his limitations did not extend so far that he couldn't see a world where Black people in America could be free. He was an American president capable of contemplating and then actualizing Black American citizenship. He did not say, oh, well, that can't be, right? Like Thomas Jefferson could not imagine Black Americans being citizens.
Well, yeah, but actually, no, I'm with you on that. But at the same time, he held meetings with Black leaders about sending Black people to Africa and or creating certain sections of America where Black people could live because, yes, yes, he did make speeches about Blacks kind of being part of America, but he also spent a good amount of time trying to give these creatures a way to live happily. So like this kind of goes back to the complication of his history, but that's something else. And I agree with you, Holler. Go for it.
And I think what you're saying, I mean, that's really important. I think that, and again, Thomas Jefferson, he comes up a lot in conversations that I have because of his legacy of
Hell yeah.
Owning his own children and all of that,
Mhm.
right? And American memory.
Damn.
And some of his.
I'm sorry. You just said something. I'm sorry just to throw you off, but like
owning his own children.
I never really.
We had an American president who owned his own children. Like you talk about first children, like in the way that man owned his children.
And one of the first babies that were born in the White House was by an enslaved woman during his presidency. And if I'm not mistaken, no, it was a mulatto child too. So what does that tell you? If I'm not mistaken, I got to look that up. But I'm sorry I'm sorry. Anyway,
no, you're all good.
I'm sorry. Go back.
That's important.
I hope I didn't throw you off. But go ahead.
No, you didn't. But I think, Thomas Jefferson wrote about.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go for it.
And she was only 14 years old. Sorry about that. And I feel like her name was Ursula or something. I'm just, all this stuff's come back in my head. But sorry about that.
Get it all out on the page. You gotta put it on the figurative page as it happens.
Exactly. Go ahead.
So I think that the question of Thomas Jefferson wrote in his later letters, he was like, I don't know, we built this country on a foundation, like we will split on this rock. He essentially said about slavery. Mm-hmm. He was like, it is not a sustainable system. And he also wrote though a lot about, he thought it was evil. He thought it was America's original sin. I mean, I'm paraphrasing.
Yes.
But he also didn't understand how America could work without it.
Right.
And he also didn't understand how, because of the moralities that people had to accept and onboard white people, like this sort of evil moral dimensions that you have to take on in order to own another human being. Mm-hmm. And then what he imagined would be the justified rancor and bitterness of Black people after, generations of being owned. He was like, I don't know how we bring these two populations together to cohabitate peaceably. So they need to go back somewhere where they don't have to look at people they hate every day, so nobody has to look at people and the white people don't have to look at people that they were raised to hate. Right. So, and I think that we're still dealing with this question. Like, how do we stand each other when we've been sitting here being gaslit since 1865? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So this question of, it is an authentic question to say, because it's as Black people, when we ask for equity and restoration, it's a big leap of trust for white Americans because they are not conditioned to think about it this way. They're like, well, if what had happened to them had happened to me, I would just want revenge. I would not be able to love these people and be citizens with them. So surely they can't love us. They can't really just want to be equal Americans. They must be mad. They must want revenge. This is like the limitations of the white American imagination, right? Mm-hmm. They don't understand like transcendent compassion and this desire for dignity that it's not even about them. They don't understand that. And I think that that's a really complicated, and you can see that, like, I've watched, because you think about, like, you look at apartheid, post-apartheid South Africa, and there are a lot of bitter white people who are like, yeah, but I remember what my grandfather did. Like, I don't blame them for not wanting to give me the job and giving it to a black guy, because like that's what we used to do to them. And they remember it, but they're still bitter because
Mm.
it's been this like complicated flipping instead of like a synthesis,
Yeah.
like a restorative synthesis. And I think that it's like, we can't just all take turns having American equity. We have to figure out how,
Mm.
like, it can't just be like you get it and then we get it, right? It needs to be
Wow.
like a more synthesized thing. And the last
Wow.
thing I will say about this like Southern American memory, because this is what started us off, is like, what did you call it? The exceptional racist?
The
The
exceptional racist.
exceptional
Yeah.
racist.
Yeah.
I think that part of that is, there are two things that I wrote down that then we veered
Mhm.
that I wanted to say. Number one is part of why they were able to romanticize and so swiftly erase and reconstruct this American memory in real time is, you know, many of those Confederate generals like just went on home, took a breath, and then like got elected to the House and the Senate.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's like we sent
Mhm.
Confederates straight back to Washington
Mm.
to
Mm.
make decisions
Wow.
immediately after the war. Like
Yes.
they weren't tried as war criminals. Like they're not Amon Gert and Heinrich Himmler. They're not like they weren't like tried as the war criminals and treasonous monsters that they were.
Mm.
We had no Nuremberg. We just like sent them back to the capital, and then they started the Ku Klux Klan, literally,
Right.
or they
Right.
or they like
Absolutely.
reactivated the KKK. So
Yeah.
we rebuilt it back into like United States federal government. We just put the Confederacy literally right back into the capital.
Yes.
So that's one part of it, and then the other part of it is like you mentioned something. I think it's a little bit actually dangerous
Mhm.
to say that it was never about slavery.
Mhm.
That it was just about different sets of like federal ideals.
Yes.
Because I
Right.
think if you read the Alexander Hamilton Stevens, who
Mhm.
was the vice president of the Confederacy, gave a speech called the Cornerstone Speech.
Mhm.
And in the Cornerstone Speech, he says that slavery is the chief cause and present concern, or something like this, of the current rupture
Mm.
with the government. He
Mm.
says explicitly, and he says it's not just economic, he says it's moral. He was like, Thomas Jefferson was concerned about this because he thought that it was morally wrong to have slaves, but it is not morally wrong to have slavery because white people are superior. This was the speech he
Yep.
gave to frame the ideology of the Confederate cause. And it was not just financial, it was not just about commerce or states' rights. It was about a sense of moral superiority to Black people in this country that was founded on this like really fucked up version of Christianity
Mhm.
also.
Mhm.
And so I think, when he says that slavery is the chief cornerstone cause of the Confederacy, we just have to like name that what it is, because I think part of it is that Southerners hide behind this idea. Well, it really was just about states' rights. It was really just about money. It's like read your own documents.
Right.
Read your own documents.
Read your
Read
own document.
read the language of your
Yeah.
leadership that says explicitly this is a moral cause and these boys were saying to fight and die because white people are better than Black people. That is literally what was on the page and out the mouth of these men. And I think that when we make them look at that, they never read that speech. They're talking about
Mm.
Robert E. Lee and how he freed his slaves before the war started and how he was a good man and he just was a Virginian before he was an American, and he morally, like, they love that shit, right? But what about the Alexander Hamilton Stevens, the dude that their contingency elected to be their vice president? That man saying these Black people are inherently inferior. We just have to remember that that is true, because it's not just about the dollars.
It's so deep that you said that. And this kind of goes back to the opening. And I knew you would go here and say exactly this. I mean, it's this concept of, well, let's use faith to say why it's okay to do what we're doing. But let's also throw in science if you ain't down with faith, because scientifically you are eugenically inferior. So my thing is this. When you're analyzing racism, when you're analyzing bigotry, I always say you have to be humble enough to see the other side. before you make an absolute conclusion as to whether the person's actions are malevolent or not, right? And I bring this up because there are a lot of people, a lot of white people that are blissfully ignorant to the concept that edifying these Southern heroes is wrong. Like they don't get it because they were raised with the romanticism. They were raised by an institution that they deem as absolute and venerable. So I want to use this to segue into my next question. You said that it is an extraordinary truth of my life that I am biologically more than half white, and yet I have no white people in my genealogy and living memory. No voluntary whiteness. I am more than half white, and none of it was consensual. White Southern men, my ancestors, took what they wanted from women they did not love, over whom they had extraordinary power, and then failed to claim their children. So my question for you is, why is there a question regarding your racial identity? And is it because of America's one-drop rule, which defined you as black by operation of law? Or is it because of a black soul you have that is unencumbered by the forced mixing or misogyny of your personal past?
Ooh. So when you say a question about my racial identity, do you mean that I could be...
Not that you're posing a question of your racial identity, but this whole conundrum poses the question of what your racial identity is, as if race is not a fallacy, but for purposes of this discussion, bringing that social question up. Why is there an issue?
Well, I think that, you started this conversation by sort of, and again, I might be paraphrasing here, but you entered this conversation setting up the context that, for a long time, race was not a thing, that race is a social construct. To the degree that makes it a thing. It's real because it's front of bus, back of bus, this water fountain, that water fountain, this school, that school, legally able to be owned or not, right? These kinds of things.
Yes.
And so I come from Black people on legal terms. And to me, I actually find the one drop rule to be a gift of my life because it means that no matter what percentage of European, genetic inheritance I've got, I am a Black person because it's a lived cultural experience. I come from people who were owned. The one drop rule, if you extend it past that, the rule of hypo descent, which I talk about in the article, hypo descent being the social and legal practice of assigning a genetically mixed race person to the race with lower social power or with less social power. And thanks to the rule of hypo descent, which can be, if I have a friend who's Afro-Korean and she considers herself a Black woman, she's got Korean experience, but, or she had a meaningful investment in the Korean side of her family, but she has the lived experience in a brown body in America, and that is a different thing. And obviously that's evolving even now because of the wave of crimes against AAPI people. But her lived experience up to this point was very much one of needing to be in solidarity with the people that people see you and lump you with, or people see you and associate you with. So to me, I guess there's just never been a question of whether or not of my Blackness, because the second that a Black woman gives birth, her baby's a Black person, because Black people are in the West, thanks to rules of hypo descent, we are actually at the bottom. African or descent puts you at the bottom of every list of any minority in terms of access to things, resources, historical oppression in groups. So every baby that comes out of a Black woman's body is a Black baby, because and I think that's part of our magic, is that we make Black babies out of any other color, any other origin.
That's pretty deep.
Every baby that comes out of a Black woman is a Black person.
Yes.
And so to me, it's you talk about, that's why, you talked about, you named white men specifically separate from white women.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the interesting things about that is that a white man knows that only a white woman, because like they're so weak, their legacy is so weak. They make a baby with a woman of any other color, and the baby is that woman's race and not theirs. So only white women can give birth to white men, which is a really complicated thing too.
Wow.
And so I think about that, and I'm like, I just am grateful for my sense of power of coming from the bodies of women who only will continue to like create more of this like wonderful blackness, this Black
Wow.
Americanness, this Black humanness. I don't know. It's not complicated to me. Because race is a social construct, and socially I am Black. I am Black as I'm grateful that my hair is this texture, so people believe me even when I'm like, it's pasty in the winter. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's not. Yeah. That was so beautifully said. I want to go into something that is a bit personal to you. The March to Freedom, Selma, 65, started on a bridge that honors a man that passionately fought to preserve slavery and segregation. His name was Edmund Pettus. In Selma, Alabama, that bridge is adorned with his name. It was dedicated in 1940, 3 decades after his death. His adopted hometown was Selma. He was a lawyer and a U.S. senator. Kind of goes back to what you were saying, right? He was also the Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. He is heralded as a great Alabamian. Do you believe Edmund Pettus should be memorialized on this bridge? Also, do you find it ironic that the bloodshed on this bridge is directly correlated to what Edmund stood for?
Is this the part where I weigh in?
Yeah, you go
personally?
for it. You go for it. Yes.
So I think that Edmund Pettus is also my great grandfather.
Yes.
He had a child after the Civil War was over. He had a child with one of the women who, came from an enslaved family that had worked on his land, and then subsequently the family continued to work for him and his family. He had some kind of affair with a woman who worked for him, and the result was my great grandfather, Will Randall, who we call son or Papa in our family.
Yes.
So my great grandfather, Papa, his father was Edmund Pettus, and Papa knew his father. Like, he knew who his father was. He knew the man. It's not a question, right? I mean, and then obviously the DNA testing allows you to confirm these kinds of things, et cetera. But the Edmund Pettus Bridge, first of all, to me, it's time for it to be the John Lewis Bridge.
Yeah.
Because, we need to inscribe it with its most recent and most transformative and valuable history. So when I think about Edmund Pettus and I think about the bridge, they're very much like two distinct questions for me, because I think about Edmund Pettus and I think about being his descendant. And I think that's part of why I wrote the article that you've been quoting. And I wrote it not even to like reconcile anything, because again, like, I'm a Black woman, the white ancestry, the value it has for me is in whatever social capital it gives me to get into rooms where I can make white people listen and help Black people, first of all. And then second of all, it gives me a legitimate stance to take that not enough white Americans take. And that, again, if we want to go back to this German conversation, I mean, I know intimately numerous people who are either of German descent whose families found their way to America, or people who were raised in Germany who are actively ashamed of the actions of their ancestors. And it's something that they have claimed. They're like, my grandfather did this. My grandfather was a Nazi. Like, I am still thinking about like how I reconcile that, because I'm so harrowed by the idea of it. And I was thinking to myself last summer, I was like, where are the descendants of the Confederates who are actively and explicitly renouncing their ancestors? Where are the people that are related to fancy white men with power who are capable of renouncing the actions of their ancestors. And I thought, well, I'm related to one, so I'll do it. The usefulness of being Edmund Pettus's great granddaughter is that I can model what it looks like to renounce the sins of your ancestors to white people because I'm related to fancy white people.
Exceptional racist.
Exactly. So to me, that's like, so it is, it's weird because it's a certain kind of white privilege that I'm using to do that. But that's what white privilege should be used to do, is to just like, if you have privilege attached to your race, you should be using it to dismantle oppression, right? And so to the degree that I'm related to a fancy white man and that has afforded me any kind of privileges, I'm going to use that privilege. It is my privilege to model how to renounce him. And so then on the other side, the bridge, I think about just as a historically minded Black American. And I think about, there's like a complicated irony about watching people, but it also is just a model of what really happens. Like, it's like literally and figuratively, like in 1965, 100 years after the end of the Civil War, we're still having to march across a bridge to get equitable access to American rights. We're still having to march across this Confederate bridge. There's still a white man gatekeeper. Like the visual and practical and ideological truth of that is like complicated and intense, but makes sense to me. But I think what doesn't make sense is to continue to just leave the bridge as it is without at least putting it in some kind of context. It's like, I don't believe in erasure either direction. Changing the bridge's name without making some note that it was once the Edmund Pettus Bridge also doesn't honor the indignity of it having been the Edmund Pettus Bridge for so long. So I don't know what that signage looks like, but it's like there should be a plaque at the top of the bridge. It says this was formerly the Edmund Pettus Bridge. A coalition in 2021 decided that it was now going to be the John Lewis Bridge to honor his contributions to American society in the form of, effectively fighting for suffrage for Black Americans in 1965. I mean, something like that,
So you just effectively provided a way to, quote, preserve history and tell the truth. And being that you are biologically more white than Black, many of your fellow white descendants argue that American history should be preserved. Conversely, your fellow Black descendants argue the same. Can you describe the difference between those two perspectives, even though you just actually provide an example, which is the difference? You know what I'm saying? Like,
I gave you an example, but I think that there's also like what it's made of, right? And it's like, and really, it's, if you take a step backward, it really comes from, I'm thinking of, I'm thinking Tom Cotton, Nicole Hannah-Jones, 1776 project versus 1619 project, right? It's like, when do we begin the story? How do we tell the truth, of what has been? Because it comes back to that other divide that I have of what we mean when we say my fellow Americans. Like, if I only want to remember white male American history, then that's one thing. But if I want to really examine what we've always been, what we have done, what we're capable of for good or ill, that's a different agenda. And I think that, it's funny. I am, and I've written about this too, I'm a pretty old-fashioned patriot in some ways. I'm a patriot because I love the idea of this country more than I love its capacity to implement those ideas. I think that when I say that, I just know that my patriotism has a stronger backbone than any of these people that don't want to tell the whole truth. Because what they're saying when they don't want to tell the truth is that they couldn't love this place if they acknowledged all of what it's been.
I mean,
and I love this place even knowing all of what it's been. When people don't want to go back and populate the past with the sins of the fathers, as well as their accomplishments, that to me indicates that they don't have the kind of unconditional love for their country that they think they do, and that I know I possess. Because I love, it's like when you think about James Baldwin said it best. He said, I love America, and it is precisely for that reason that I demand the right to criticize her perpetually, right? Or something like that. Like there's constant room for improvement. We know that from the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson wrote in, it's like either Article 2, Section 5 or Article 5, Section 2. I can't remember exactly, but it's the part that leaves room to make amendments because they knew they didn't get it right. And they knew that we'd have to evolve and change past whatever they wrote in 1776 anyway. Yeah. So I think that this we need to leave room for change, and we need to say, I can love this country and want to see it change too. We can hold two truths together at once.
Yeah, but isn't that divisive and anti-American propaganda? Because at least that's what Trump said when it came to his federal backlash against the teaching of critical race theory and training on white privilege.
That's a matter of perspective, right? Again, I think it's anti-American to resist resist naming unjust taxation without representation entire Black population of DC, for example. Mm-hmm. I think that it's anti-American to resist telling the truth in the face of oppression, to resist acknowledging history. Those things to me are anti-American. And the people that are susceptible to rhetoric that says looking at our past and criticizing our forefathers, the people that are resistant to looking backward, those are un-American people. Yes. Those are people that have gotten too comfortable with what America could very easily devolve into, which is just another European offshoot, devolved, susceptible to fascism and tyranny state that privileges certain kinds of white supremacy and causes people then to behave in evil and cowardly ways, right? Yes. And our country was created to reject that, and we didn't get it right, but we did have documents that left room for us to work toward getting it right. And if we can't acknowledge the ways we failed in the beginning, we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, you are a revolutionary because you tell the truth, and you telling the truth is considered rebellious, but you are just an honest person, and you are a Black American patriot. I admire you greatly, and you are way too smart at such a young age.
I'm old.
I have faith in you, and I greatly appreciate your sweets of lasting value. I'm honored to talk to you about your journey, and we are all so excited to see where your journey is going to go. Thank you for spending time with me, Caroline. We definitely have to have a part 2.
Yes, we do. I love this conversation. Thank you so much. I'm Caroline Randall Williams, and you're listening to Invisible Blackness.